Terra Symbolica fans, uh, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Vassilios Adrahtas, with whom I go a long way back, at least 15 years, if not more, in scholarly milieus that we've both moved around in. Dr. Adrahtas is convener of Greek studies at the University of New South Wales here in Sydney. And he also teaches Islamic studies at the University of Western Sydney. Vasily, you're an expert in phenomenology, the history of religions, Byzantine patristics, and otherwise. John Damascene, your patron in a way.
Yeah.
You've co-authored at least 10 books ranging from philosophical to theological to literary themes, like your books on Kazantzakis. Um, you are very active in various Greek community events, promoting Hellenism in a very rigorously intellectual and popular way, which is very commendable, obviously. And we've done a few things in the past together. I think some round tables, some at least one volume co-edited. So, I've learned a lot from you. And today we have set before us the daunting task in search of the sacred. How are we going to do it, Vasily? You tell me. How are we going to find the sacred?
Look, I think first of all, I should thank you for the invite to Terra Symbolica. It's always a pleasure to, meet and speak with you, but also do things that pertain to our common interests. Now, how we're going to do this search of the sacred, I think it's going to come naturally because it's what we have been doing, for, most of our lives. So basically, through this talk and episode, we are just going to, present in some brief and concise manner what is more or less, our own quest for the sacred.
Uh, uh, I couldn't agree more. That makes it so relatable. So if I can throw the first volley at you then in
Yeah.
relation to defining sacredness. I had a class recently out at Campion on sacred art and architecture, and it was the very first topic was the sacred in prehistory, so archaic civilization, if you can call it civilization. It's more like we started at in the Aurignacian period with the Lascaux caves and all these sorts of things. And I thought, how do I begin? Do I start with talking about religion? But it's not conventional religiosity back then. So let's not begin with defining religion as Augustine and Cicero did in terms of binding something over and over again. I started talking about sacredness generally, but then the thought came to me, should I have spoken about sacred or the divine? Well, which is it, Vasily? How do we begin this journey? What are the conceptual categories that we need?
Yes, I suppose we, from the very start, should make the distinction between what we generally call sacred. Something is sacred, which is an adjective, and the sacred as a noun, a very unique sort of entity. So the sacred is one thing. Sacred things are something different. We can come to this as we go on and see what is meant when someone calls something sacred. But basically, I think that the main question you are trying to explore now is the question of the sacred.
Yes.
Now, uh, the I think the easiest way is to start a bit apophatically, if we may use, a very theological term. I mean, what is given, what you observe, in reality is human life forms in whatever manner, the expressions of human life in in a variety of ways. This is what we have in front of us as scientists, as scholars, as people who start by observation. Now, these life forms, or to be more correct, certain of these life forms um, relate themselves to something that they are not the cause of. They are not inherently responsible for. So there are human life forms, we could call them, using a very general term, society, culture, but everyday life as well. And within these life forms, um, the human being affirms that it relates through them with something that they are not, that goes beyond them, that is beyond them, that they are not the cause of. So there is always this implicit or explicit otherness within the everyday, the social, the cultural, the political, the economical reality of us as human beings, without which otherness, this field, let's call it that way, of sameness, of which we are part of, doesn't make sense. It only makes sense because it's juxtaposed to something other, many a time this other being the cause of it, or in other cases, just being a backdrop, but a necessary backdrop. So if we are to start looking for the sacred, we start with what we have in front of us, with human life forms in their, raw materiality, as we observe them, as we create them, as we are part of them. And then we look into the cracks that these life forms allow for us by pointing to what they need in order to be sustained. And that is where we should look for that sacred. I know it sounds a bit. It's an exercise in sort of apophatic, negative sort of thinking. But if we want to go beyond uh, the human as such, we have to start with the human.
which is
There's no other way.
which is a phenomenological approach in a sense.
Absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, because it kind of presupposes this subject, as in the human subject and object relationship, without calling it a relationship specifically yet. Now we're sticking with general terms and categories, are reaching out to a point of reference, a transcendent, if you like, point of reference that is ad extra. It's not.
Yes.
It's not a priori ad intra. It doesn't come from within in the first instance, as you say.
Yeah.
If that's the case, if we're going to just navigate some of the terminology that's conventionally used, in what way would the sacred be distinct from the divine? In
Yeah.
Greek, would it be to hieron and to theon or something like that?
Yes.
So what are
The sacred. Yeah.
similarity?
The
Yeah.
sacred is the hieron, and we have in English words like hierarchy, hierophant, hierarchical, which relate to this sort of word, the hieron, the sacred. Now, of course, as you said, the divine is the theon. Now, theon, of course, belongs to, again, the same field of otherness, but it's the sacred rendered now in a specific way, uh, mostly through what we know as theism. Theism, it's personal. It relates with the human being in let's say, providential way. It takes care of the domain of sameness, which is culture, society, politics, economy. But this understanding, this personal providential being, inverted commas, called the theon, the divine. Now, this should not, and I think it's very clear that does not exhaust the semantics of the hieron. The hieron, the sacred, can be something broader, okay, not necessarily deeper, but broader.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean, uh, what the category of the sacred gains in width, uh, it loses in sort of depth. Uh, the divine is a category, an experience which has a certain depth, which the hieron, the sacred, doesn't, but it covers more or much more of a field. And in the study of religion, conventionally what we call religion, we want to start with the most basic category, being able to cover for as broad a spectrum of experiences as possible. So yeah, the sacred is basically the field of sheer otherness, not simple otherness, like you are other than me, but sheer otherness, that you in a way you don't belong on the same level or the same field. uh so that's the sacred, and when it's rendered in personal providential ways, it becomes more and more what we know as the divine, and of course what we know as God.
So this, the distinction then, could you say, between the divine and the sacred, in relation to the former, it's a matter of attenuation to personal circumstances that cover the networks of, let's say, various domains that the human being interacts within and with, the political and the economic. I'm just recapitulating it because that makes me think of religion as also an attenuation of the sacred by virtue of a response to it in a personal way. But something that is interesting, I think, is, in those terms, if religion is a response to the sacred mediated through a more personalistic divine agency, can we speak of the sacred on religious terms, or is the sacred, let's say, religion beyond all the particular religions that we, study as historians of religion: Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, etc.? Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm
Yeah,
making
yeah,
sense.
it does make sense. And what I think there's the two ways to go about this. One way is to see the sacred, and of course the experience of the sacred, uh, as something that is prior to religion, and goes beyond religion, but which makes religion what it is. Another way is to see it as uh, religion more than religion. So like a primary sort of religion that is, much more than what we call conventional religion, a pristine sort of religion. So this, I would dare call it a primary religiosity. Primary, fundamental religiosity is what should one see as connected, stemming from the experience of the sacred. And this primary religiosity is responsible for what we call conventional, institutional, traditional religion.
Hmm. It's foundational then, the sacred, to all of these manifestations that
Yes, I think it is. I think it is, and it's the only way you can um, um, allow for it to have a very consistent epistemologically and methodologically place in the study of religion, because you need to bring religion, reduce it to something. Now, you can reduce it to itself, but you can reduce it much more let's say, reasonably and convincingly to something else, but not something else that betrays it, but on the contrary, amplifies its distinctiveness.
Mm. Well, I mean, if that's the case, I mean, when you were speaking, I was thinking of, in terms of primary religiosity and a priori sort of experiential category that sheds light upon and gives meaning towards religious modalities, let's say. If you think about the sacred in those terms, Karen Armstrong spoke about these sorts of things in some of her more popular works, like A Short History of Myth. Joseph Campbell was all over this in his voluminous tomes, in relation to, although, Campbell, Eliade as well, Mircea Eliade is more relevant for us, I think, a little bit later on in this conversation when we
Yep.
speak about how the sacred manifests itself without saying much more. But I'm talking now about popular people who have popularized the study of the sacred through textual analyses, through a kind of historical rendition. Someone like Armstrong will say, well, the first intuition that the Neanderthals had was of a sky father before they moved towards particular expressions of this high God, which lends a lot of credence actually to monotheism. So it can
Mm.
be used by the various monotheistic religious traditions, this kind of an argument. But in light of all these things, how does one even begin to study the sacred unless you find yourself talking to you or to me or to somebody who has, you've got a PhD in studies in religion. So do I. That's your second PhD. I should have mentioned that you have two. Unless there's a third you haven't told me about, Vasily. But how does one even begin to do a serious study of the sacred?
I think that, beyond the phenomenological step we mentioned at the beginning, and another way to do this, let's say, rigorously and let's say seriously, is historically. I mean, what we are discussing right now uh, has evolved and has unfolded historically during the last at least 200 years. I mean, already from the medieval times, the Western Christian world would be, interacting with the non-Christian world more and more and more, and this process became very prominent in modernity through colonialism and so forth. Now, the more the Western Christian person would become aware of the non-Western, non-Christian, uh, they started thinking, okay, uh, there are things here that seem similar to ours, but they are not the same. So how are we going to accommodate these sort of stuff? So people started, collecting materials, through observation from all other religions, whatever we call religions or spiritual traditions, and they started, trying to put them under categories. They saw that, not everything has a god. Not all people believed in a god, although Plutarch would say, that that's not correct,
There are
or
no cities
Herodotus,
without gods. That's right.
yeah. But they saw that, some people just had, notions of mana, or a totem, or they would be, much more animistic. They didn't have the god figure. So they started exploring possibilities, of putting all these or observational materials in boxes to categorize them. And slowly, they were led to the category of the sacred. Now, of course, there are others who say, look, the sacred is one option, but we can call it the absolute, or we can call it the ultimate. But nowadays, within our domain of understanding, conventionally what we call religion, the sacred has, in a way, dominated. And a very we should recall that, theoretically, this social historical unfolding of becoming aware of more and more religious traditions, a very prominent stage in this unfolding is the work of a very interesting scholar, a French scholar, Fustel de Coulanges, who wrote The Ancient City.
Yeah,
And
great
in
book.
that book, his amazing book, he was the first one to draw attention to the notion of the sacred as very, very fundamental for the structure and the construction of classical ancient life on all levels.
Yes.
And after de Coulanges, we have Durkheim, Emile Durkheim, and his student Marcel Mauss. And then we have, of course, all slightly together, we have Rudolf Otto with his magisterial work, das Heilige.
They translated the idea of the holy.
The idea of the whole in English,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
das Heilige means the sacred.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's much more.
Mm.
And then after that, we have the work of Weber, Max Weber, with his understanding of the charismatic person, and he works a lot with the sacred as well. And then we have Eliade.
Yeah.
So there is a certain series. Eliade comes in when all the, let's say, foundational work has been, done already, and his contribution is to concentrate on the ways that the sacred is embodied through hierophanies, to which we will refer, as we go on. So it's nice to look into these scholars and see how they giving one another the space to talk about the sacred through their own work. So it builds up, and we reach the mid of the 20th century with the work of Eliade. So we're not talking now tonight, in some sort of vacuum. We're not,
No,
inventing, the wheel. We have this background, and it's already there. So it's very helpful to be always mindful of it.
absolutely. And as you were talking now, as you were speaking, this positivist, more or less, approach, which was important because, as you say, it's empirical observation based on data, which is documentary evidence texts. And these are a reflection of the thought worlds of the people who produce these texts. So these are taxonomies created by some of these figures, and the hermeneutical approaches that they undertook. When you mentioned Weber, my mind went immediately to what was it entitled, the Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which is such an important work. I mean, it gets all of these great works of the 20th century, early 20th century, mid 20th century, gets revised and broken down over time, especially in light of postmodernism, but it's still very relevant. My thinking, however, went immediately when you mentioned Eliade. There's another point of convergence that lands on him. So definitely he's part of this sort of history of religions approach. But then there's also something happening around the same time coming out of Jungian psychology with the emphasis on archetypes and the emergence of the archetype in one's conscious response towards the sacred as mediated. And without talking about that yet, because we'll get that with Hierophanies,
Yes, of
how does
course.
Eliade fit into this picture? Because I just read something in the introduction to one of his, it was his first major work. Uh, what was it called? The Cosmos, the Myth of the Eternal Return, Cosmos and History.
Yep.
And in that book, he's written a preface in the 1970s, decades later, because it was released just after, as you know, just after the Second World War. So the tyranny of history and, nationalistic approaches to history features there, and his response and critique of that, irrespective of how people try to construe Eliade.
Yeah.
In any case, but he says, look, archetypes are all the rave, and they have been for decades now, since Carl Gustav Jung published all of his work on them. And I just want to clarify that I'm not using them in the same way. Could you please comment on this psychological? Or if it's not relevant, please, we can move on to Eliade. But
No. First, I would like to add that, since you referred to evidence and empirical evidence and texts, we should always keep in mind that it's not about just written text, but any kind of text. And because you are so much interested, in visual materials and the arts, it's also visual text, and not just visual text, but also performative text. Actions as such, rituals. So all sorts of texts, in the very broad sense that communication theory uses the word text, are the observable, empirical evidence that we collect when we
yes,
study the sacred and, by extension, hierophanies. Now, Eliade, the first book of Eliade, the first major book of Eliade, is his PhD thesis, which was, not his PhD thesis. He has a PhD thesis on on yoga and immortality, which is, the first big work he produced. But then he wrote a work on shamanism, and also our work on the patterns in religion. But in the late 40s, I think we have the first, if my memory doesn't, betray me, the first version in German of the work that will appear under the title Le Sacré, Le Profane, the sacred and the profane. So that thought goes really is situated really in the mid of the 20th century. It's very, very indicative that it comes after World War II, where we have generally a breakthrough and an attempt to redefine, reinvent Western values. Now, Eliade was part of a general movement, let's say, a group of people around Jung. If I remember correctly, it was called the Eranos Circle. And lots of prominent figures, were part of that circle, which would meet, occasionally for a period of years. And Eliade was an active member of this group before he went to the United States, where he would become the professor of the history of ideas, religion at the University of Chicago. And of course, leading, and guiding generations of scholars, until the end of his life in 1986. So Eliade is a historian, but at the same time, he's a phenomenologist. That's why he coined the very interesting phrase historical phenomenology in the study of religion. Now, phenomenology, we know, can be very, very close in some of its insights to psychology. So Eliade comes into this psychological interest in motifs, archetypes. By the way, he has written a work with the title Archetypes and Myths. And because he is a phenomenologist, and that allowed him to appreciate the kind of psychological thinking that Jung was promoting, which was, of course, at the time very, very subversive. And yeah, I mean, what sort of psychology is this? Uh, like collective consciousness. What sort of what sort of thing is that? Oh, archetypes. It's working together with and starting, and going along with Freud for a certain period of years. After that, this seems to be very diverging. From what we know as Freudian psychology. So he could appreciate, however, this subversive, radical, innovative understanding of the psychological tradition. So, and I think because he was a phenomenologist, I mean, that would be sort of my comment, how he managed to blend in with the other figures. And one other figure, great figure, perhaps sometime we can talk about him, was Gershom Scholem, uh, who was, on mysticism, messianism and Jewish eschatology. He
I
was,
don't know him. Yeah.
yeah, he was part of this group as well.
Wow. So they refined that kind of the insights that they got out of that kind of like explosion that came out of Jungian psychology in relation to their own respective fields of interest. And it's all very interdisciplinary what's taking place there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Mario, they have been accused many a time for being, for introducing in science perennialism. But I think that's not fair. I mean, we have to take perennialism, as a movement in the first half of the 20th century as a context within which they interacted.
Yes.
But I think it's unfair to just, regard them, Jung, Eliade, Scholem, just as taking perennialism and domesticating it and making it more of a more academically, accepted. They're much more than that. They're not simply, brokers, academic brokers of perennialism.
But I mean, that's a very important point. And could you define perennialism for our viewers who don't, who might not be familiar with it, a phenomenon that swept? I mean, it was very popular in theosophical and esoteric circles in the early
Yes, yes.
century, popularized by Aldous Huxley and others in the mid 20th century. Could you please comment on it a little bit further?
Yeah, basically, it's the idea that fundamentally, the what we call the human being or human civilization is defined by a tradition of knowledge, of wisdom, that is the same for everyone. Underlies and permeates all cultures as a set of specific values. So this traditionalism, we could call it, because they regard it as eternal and always remaining the same, they called it, using the Latin word perennial, as a perennialism.
Yes.
So that's basically the concept and the gist of the ideological, agenda that they have. And we have people that come from the Christian spectrum, people who come from the Islamic spectrum, the Jewish, and of course the Hindu a lot,
Well, Eliade intersects with that because he spends a
a lot.
bit
Yeah.
of time in India, falls in love, all those sorts of things. But it's interesting that you mentioned this topic because the other day, as I was discussing, we were going through Göbekli Tepe, which is a very important Neolithic site which gives evidence to religiosity as an antecedent to civilization in a way, because it was built by hunter-gatherers well before the agrarian revolution in 5,000 BC, 7,000 years ago. But then we started looking at Mesopotamia and Egypt, and some of the students began to pick up on the commonalities in terms of creation myths, in terms of the construction of temples to embody creation myths and allusions to things. Well, how then is Christianity any different is what they asked. They presumed that there might be an embedded perennialism here. And I said, well, Christianity is common because it's part of the common human response to the divine, but it is sufficiently different.
Yeah.
As a Christian myself. So I gave them an example of, in all of the creation myths that we discussed, the demiurge, the creator figure, is he posterior to the creation or anterior to the creation? What do you mean? Well, does he come before or after? Well, after. There's something there beforehand, but that's not the Christian teaching. The Christian teaching is that Christ as Logos, begotten of the Father forever, is the agent through whom the creation is made before creation was ever there. So he's different. And we did the same with the incarnation. We said, well, you have avatars, in Hinduism, holy figures being inhabited for a temporary period of time by the gods. It's never articulated in such a permanent manner as you have with Christianity, where the transcendent Son of God takes human flesh once and for all as Christ and goes through the gamut of human experiences apart from sin, including death. This is unique. So I tried to give this to them so as not to cause scandal, but for me, it wasn't at all coming out of the tradition that you and I come from. To talk about the commonalities is just natural without compromising my particular approach, which is
Yeah,
not at the expense of anyone else's. It's just I like to see Jesus in it if I can. If not, it doesn't matter. It's treated on its own terms. So, this is an interesting and practical topic.
yeah, it is, and it's very important, and touches the base of the study of what we call conventional religion, because one could say, look, if there are no commonalities, then there is no subject matter, there's no discipline. If you're studying one thing which is unique, then this is not about science. Doesn't study unique instances, but things that have some sort of perpetuity and recurrence, and so there must be something common between phenomena. So to put them together and study them, and have what we call the study of religion, or the study of what I would call hierophanic experiences, but or the sacred. Now we must be careful here. For instance, in Eliade, we find in this work, he writes on the patterns. He talks about patterns. Now we can call something. We can talk about commonalities, or we can talk about patterns or motifs, or, as you said before, modalities. Now, in all these cases, there is something which is the same and something which is different. Uh, we are not talking about identities. We have two phenomena are not identical. They are the same, which means that they are not identical. Otherwise, they wouldn't be the same. They have some sort of difference. It's this difference that makes them the same, similar, by at the same time, allowing their distinctiveness.
Yes.
However, we should also try to, in a way, substantiate more what brings these things together, and we see them as belonging together. And I think that is what we could call experiential equivalence. So you have a figure, let's say a god in one religion, and you have another figure which is, not a god, but a kind of, let's say, sacred figure. So you have those two, and they are so similar. They seem to have the same traits, characteristics. Now, it is because the function of the one in the system one and the function of the other in system two, those functions produce the same results for the people within the system. So that's why we feel that there is a commonality, that these are the same. I'll give you an example from Indigenous Australia. When the whites came here, Westerners, Christians, with their missions, and they were talking about, God in heavens. Well, the indigenous people didn't have any God in the heavens, you know, but immediately the indigenous people understood that these people, they have a law which is like their law. So they understood that their talk about God in heavens is the basis of their law. Law being, the most hierophanic sacred thing that indigenous people have. So they understood that they have a law. How did they do that? How did they um, manage to correlate experiences that were so different? Because they understood, they were so insightful to understand and see that this belief of yours in God in heavens produces results, practical results, everyday results, that the dreamings produce for us in our system. So we can bring them together and talk about the two laws. I
Wow,
don't know if
that's
it makes
fantastic.
sense.
Yeah, no, that's such a good example and relevant to our context here in the Antipodes. But you mentioned again the term hierophany.
Yeah.
Shall we define it? Is it the unique contribution of Mircea Eliade to the discipline, this term, or did it exist before?
One of his many contribution, and perhaps the most Iliadian.
Well, he had
He
several
coined the
terms that he
term.
coined. So he
Yeah,
coined this term. He coined
he
it.
coined the term. Yeah,
Coined it.
we have the term in English. We have the term hierophant, but we didn't have the term hierophany, which is the hierophania, which is the manifestation, expression of the sacred. So anything, it can be anything. It can be a physical object, can be a person, it can be an idea, a text, a ritual, an art, an aspect of the universe. Anything can be a manifestation of the sacred, and virtually anything can be a hierophany. So in that way, he managed to bring in a term that could, um, um, cut across theory and practice, ritual worship and ethics and belief. So cover everything, because potentially, although these things, are quite different, ritual, belief, art, uh, and ethics. At the end of the day, they all express the sacred of a given system. So they belong all to the same level of observational data.
Yeah, wow, that's a hermeneutic net, if you like, that
Yes.
brings all of these various uh, expressions of the sacred, whether as a revelation or a response to that revelation or apparition, or even, I mean, because he distinguished between the, let's say, media through which these hierophanies were disclosed, the natural and manufactured world. So it's a tree. Well, there's something of the entirely other disclosed through that commonplace object that you experience as a tree, which distinguishes it now from all other trees. And that's the hierophany. It's the
Yep.
same with mountains and rivers. And, the next step for him was to say, well, because a lot of these natural objects, which are, let's say, the first in the human experience in terms of proximity, we were in nature before we began to make villages and towns and later cities, then the earliest architectonic structures recapitulate in stone and brick and whatever else these natural objects through which the sacred was manifested. That's very clear, it's very clear in Genesis when you have the temple constructed by Solomon, and the smoke comes down into the temple the same way as the smoke appeared on Mount Sinai when Moses received the Decalogue. So it's obvious in these very, quintessential texts for the Judeo-Christian tradition, but he made it so broad that actually you can now see it in the Mesopotamian ziggurats, you can see it in Egyptian step pyramids, you can see it in Egyptian temples, you can see, and not just limited to the Near East, everywhere, everywhere. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. And it's very interesting, Mario, and I will relate this to some of your research, that every hierophany as a manifestation of the sacred becomes a door that and a gate towards the sacred. So in this sense, a hierophany is axis mundi.
That's right.
It is. It is
That's
an
right.
axis wood, because potentially any hierophany can work as a gate, as a doorway towards the sacred. Uh, so this, how much pertains to architectural and urban architecture and the construction of cities. Cities are always created, around, initially, originally, around a certain sacred, now as an adjective, sacred point of reference,
Yes.
which is becomes the privileged way of connecting with the sacred.
That's right, which is usually always, well, not unilaterally. It's either conceived of as originating, which makes sense, from the vertical perspective beyond the stars or associated with the firmament. So if we use the term heaven in relation to that, the sacred can come ultimately from there, but not exclusively, because the underworld is another uh, fons et origo, let's say, of the
Yeah,
sacred,
yeah, yeah.
which it erupts. And in that way, if the sacred manages in its manifestation as a hierophany to cross the conventional cosmic tiers of the celestial, which is the starry sky, indistinguishable from what we would call heaven in Christian parlance, the terrestrial or the earthly realm, and the subterranean, then that is an axis mundi, because all the levels of the world are manifested there. It brings with it this manifestation of the sacred, which is anterior in a way to one or more of these levels of reality. It brings them forth as well. And so you have the axis mundi, but if, for example, the Egyptian temple is constructed in such a way that it summarizes the very first manifestation of all these levels of reality, say when the demiurge brought the primordial hill out of the watery expanse of chaos, and you have order emerging from chaos with the god standing upon the stone, whether it's Ptah or Ra or anyone else. Well, if all that's architecturally depicted somehow within the temple, you got the waters in, let's say, the depicted in the skirtings, the equivalent of the skirtings, let's say, and you have the starry sky in the cornices and on the ceiling, and you have the hill in the center with the statue of the god on top of it. It is both an axis mundi and an imago mundi, an image of the world. So
Yeah,
here
of course.
the imagination, uh, that which is disclosed, to go back to what you were saying originally, the totally other is configured within the mind, and together with an array of architectural, geometric, mathematical skill and artifice, is reproduced. And why is it reproduced? So that the human being can be once again ensconced by and in close proximity to those that time when the sacred was first revealed, let's say. And there are other terms he throws in there: ontophagy,
Oh, yeah, yeah,
the
absolutely.
fullness of being was first revealed, and so on and so forth. So it's quite a good term and quite a useful term. Is it still in current in the discipline? Is the discipline did a transition? And maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but I wanted to ask you. We have the history of religions. Did it disappear with Eliade, and if not with Eliade, then with his main successor, Culianu, right? Or did it evolve into studies in religion, which is, I'm a graduate of that, let's say. My PhD is
Yeah, yeah. You
from the
you have you,
university,
it's a fair point.
you know.
Unfortunately, the the conceptual potentiality of hierophany wasn't explored in our discipline. I think that Eliade himself was responsible in a paradoxical way for that, because from a certain point onwards, he abandoned. He didn't use the term that. Yeah, he didn't use the term that much. We have, of course, a bunch of students of Eliade in lots of disciplines, as for instance, history of religions, ethnography, social sciences, that do use hierophany. But again, the term remained limited, although it's a very strong and has a strong potentiality analytically and methodologically speaking. I think that in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, it's being rediscovered more and more. And I see that, more and more works slowly come into literature by using, if not exclusively, but also the term hierophany. Um, the interesting thing for me is perhaps to see, the types of hierophany that exist, because there is a typology. Eliade coined the term. He talked about the dialectics of hierophanies, which is, something mundane, something which is of the level of the same, manifesting something that belongs to the level of the other. So this dialectics. But then he quite didn't go into, exploring more the potential of the term. But there is, I believe, a whole typology that can be, and basically different typologies. For instance, the initial experience of the sacred through hierophanies is something that we can designate as primary hierophanies. So the understanding of a mountain, let's say Mount Olympus, as sacred, which is a manifestation of the sacredness, which is nature as such, for the ancient Hellenes. So that mountain within that context constitutes a primary hierophany. Now, ancient Greek religion, or religions to be more correct, developing through the archaic classical period and using such hierophanies, and not only a mountain, but also a river or a forest or other aspects of the natural environment. Now, they become, institutionalized, they have rituals. Now, these are secondary hierophanies. So religions institutionally are traditional religions, okay, which have a life, in space and time. We can call them secondary hierophanies.
Yep.
And then whatever comes out of these hierophanies, let's say due to reaction, a sense of secularization and re-enchantment in modernity. So we have new religions, new religious movements that want to, subvert religion, which is basically the secondary hierophanies. These we can call, and this is where we belong as an era and age, tertiary hierophanies. So we have three, a typology that puts, hierophanies in a certain linear understanding. Let's say three phases development of hierophanies. Now, another way to look at hierophanies is by starting with a term you used, foundational, foundational. There is a foundational hierophany, which is the point of reference for every other hierophany in, through, beyond religion, whatever. This, for instance, from a Christian perspective, Jesus is the foundational hierophany.
Yes. Yep.
Every other hierophany in Christianity refers back to this hierophany. Okay.
Yes.
It's foundational. So after that, what sort of hierophanies do you have? You have hierophanies which more or less interpret this hierophany. They render it in a certain way. So we have hermeneutical hierophanies. And some of them are primary, basic, because they have a great impact in space and time. But others are not, that influential, and we could call them peripheral or secondary. Now, an interesting thing here is that these peripheral or secondary hierophanies are what we call established religion, institutional religion. So institutional religion is basically, in terms of hierophanies, at the periphery, it's secondary.
Yeah.
Look,
that
because
makes, yeah.
basically religion translates the foundational hierophany via, or not via, the primary hermeneutic hierophanies. It translates that foundational hierophany in basically, I would say, four ways. One is mysticism. The other is legalism. The third one is ethics. And the fourth one is ritualism. So that's basically what institutionally established religions are made of. They are made of rituals, they are made of ethics, they are made of devotional, and mysticism, a more, let's say, new and sophisticated sort of experience, and legal rulings. So you have this four makeup of institutional religion, which basically, although it seems the most powerful part of it, it's not. It's not. The most powerful part is imperceptible, it permeates, it's everywhere, but it's not easily you cannot easily pinpoint it down and trace it.
That's so interesting. It's so interesting because of the paradox, precisely the paradox that it's on the, let's say, level of the peripheral hierophany that one can begin to acclimatize towards the foundational one, which is nevertheless beyond any hierarchical structure. And that just, I thought of Genesis immediately. God is in the garden in the initial instance. He's not in the temple until later. The temple is created later. The body of Christ in the initial instance is his flesh and blood, as, shed on the cross, and through his death, his resurrection is kind of like the quintessential foundational manifestation of the sacred that gives meaning to the crucifixion, the mystical or Last Supper, and not only his teaching throughout his ministry. He keeps saying the Son of Man will be delivered and crucified, and the disciples are scratching their heads, but also the Old Testament prophecies. So it's kind of like a hierophany that goes forwards and backwards in history and opens up understanding on multiple levels, right? The Christophanic, let's say, hierophany, or the theophany par excellence.
Yeah,
So that's so interesting. Are these categories? Did you come up with this taxonomy of definitions?
yeah.
Wow, that's so
Yeah,
so.
yeah, that's part of my work, my research work in terms of the theory of our discipline. Now, it's very interesting. It's very interesting, and I think you alluded to it. Uh, and it's paradoxical. Although in institutional established religiosity is at the periphery, it's a secondary hermeneutic set of hierophanies. It's only through that level that you can get to the other levels. It's
Because I don't.
very difficult. It's extremely difficult, if at all possible, to have access unmediated. So why is this? Because it's this established, this let's say religious institutionality that preserves in the most eloquent way the distinctness of the sacred. The sacred is preserved beyond religion as well, in society, in politics, in there are hierophanies within those levels, but it's very difficult, to identify them and relate them to the sacred, and it's more much of a debate, issue. But let's say, for instance, um, capitalism. Okay, is capitalism a hierophany? Of course, it is a hierophany. I mean, it's a driving force, for something that is of paramount importance for a certain person or a certain society. But it's the sacred there, in a way, has faded so much that it's not really easily perceived. But in religion, in this set of hierophanies, the sacred is in its distinctiveness still, although peripheral and uh, let's say, so detached from the foundation. So, because it's preserved there so distinctively, conspicuously, it's where you start from. It's where you
Yes,
start from. So, someone has to go into an establishment,
yes,
and find ways to go to the foundation. But
yes,
even in new religions and new religious movements, where they are supposed to be, as according to the first typology, a tertiary hierophanic order, uh, subversive and reactionary to the second, which is the institution. Even those become institutions with themselves. After a while, they become all the new religious movements by now, at least those who have survived, and persisted. They are institutions on their own and into themselves.
yes, yeah, that's right. The way that I was thinking of it in terms of we the foundational hierophany um, is also separated from us by virtue of the fact that I'm not living in 33 AD in Jerusalem, as in I live in 2025, and so there has to be an interface between me and this is particularly why I like the rendition of, for example, the rites, the rituals that take place in Christianity, from the point Catholic Church or the traditional churches, Orthodox Church, etc., from the point of view of participation in those events through the interface of the Mass. Because there's like a dual understanding, let's say, in terms of what happens at the consecration of the Eucharist, that the Holy Spirit comes down and turns the bread and the wine into Christ's body and blood, which is true on one register, but then the other register is that it's a participation in that foundational hierophany where Christ himself, as the God-man, took the bread and the wine and said, "This is my body and this is my blood." And that was always more appealing to me, in a
Yeah,
sense, because it just made sense that, well, if he's the eternal God within whom all the ages are contained, then whatever he wrought in history can be accessed via response in any given context or age, especially by those who evoke his
absolutely.
name. So that made sense. But that's such a fascinating
And
delineation
that's a way, now
category.
you're describing a way of utilizing, uh, a theory of hierophany's approach in understanding, vital theological questions of liturgics, patristic theology, understanding of tradition, dogma.
That's
Perhaps the topic of another discussion, of course.
We'll do it. Yeah, yeah. If you're interested, if you're keen, I would love
Yeah,
to.
yeah, but yeah, they are. Yeah.
So, I mean, if we were to talk about then in relation to the Australian context, because this is an area, so as you know, we were talking a few weeks ago that I'll be teaching, and I've taught in the past comparative religion, or let's say religion 101, the big five plus. The plus
Yeah.
I usually have is Confucianism, Taoism, a few other things, new religious movements, which you made sure, you have to cover this because it's part of the discipline. But the big five, for those who don't know, conventionally the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and of course Hinduism and Buddhism. Um, but then indigenous religion, the religion of the First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, is something that I'm less familiar with. I'm fascinated by it. I think it's really, really interesting and awesome, but I don't know much about it. So if we were to, and you're an expert in it, I have to add, with a lot of good connections in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community, from what I understand as well. So, does the sacred and the use of hierophanies, can it help us to understand the religious experiences of Indigenous Australians? Can this concept be applied there? I mean, I
Yes.
understand that it can, but how is what.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. My answer is, straightforward in the affirmative. But at the same time, Indigenous Australian religions, or what I like to call, life worlds, are a great test to this theory. Why? Because one has to make modifications to the theory, and that's only when a theory is scientific. When you can modify it, test it, correct it, and make it apply more pertinently to the subject matter. Otherwise, it's an ideological construct, and then you slice everything according to that concept and construct, and you're not studying reality, you are creating it according to your own image and likeness. Now, when I was confronted with this, I saw that, the classical, let's say, or conventional understanding of a theory of hierophany didn't quite fit, didn't quite, do the job. So, for one thing, which is perhaps the most telling one, we refer to the sacred as being sheer otherness, or as you said, total other, das ganz andere, total otherness. Yeah, but the Indigenous Australian worldviews are about the same, about place and everything being part of the place and myself being part of it. So it's all here the same. We are the same. There's no what's sheer otherness. So if we are to the um, the category of the sacred. In the case of Indigenous Australia, what that famous anthropologist of Indigenous Australia, William Stanner, called the dreaming, not dreamings, but the dreaming. Now, if we are to understand the dreaming as a comprehensive unifying principle, as the sacred, it has to be understood not as sheer otherness, but as sheer sameness. So the totally same. Now, what is the totally same? Now, the totally same is something unknown. You know, we belong to the indigenous people. The experience of indigenous people, you know, is belonging to a level which is the same. Okay, and becoming more and more part of it. But what's, to put it in a very raw way, what's same 100%? What's this 100% same? Now, this 100% sameness is sheer sameness, and it's unknown. And your journey, your journey as an indigenous person is to be more and more and more part of this journey that leads to it. So you retain this unknowing and unknown dimension trait of the totally other, but in a reverse way, as a totally same.
That's so interesting. You know, it's apophatic in a way. And
Yes, it is. It is again, but within sameness itself, and not having sameness here and juxtaposed to otherness.
yeah, it's
The
like, you know,
only sheer otherness that indigenous people, sorry for me, going on like this,
no, no, go ahead.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
because it's something very, very close to my, emotionality as a scholar. If ever, and they did, of course, indigenous people come face to face with sheer otherness, that was through conquest, through the colonial.
Mhm.
Before that, there was no sheer otherness. There was only degrees of sameness. And sheer sameness, which is always away, it's always beyond, it's always more. So that sacred can be retained with this modification. And then what is the manifestation of this sacred? The dreaming, of course, which are the dreamings, the particular dreamings, which can be anything, in Indigenous Australia, from a waterhole to a species of fauna or flora, or to any aspect of the environment, or even an artifact or a song or a ritual or initiation, anything. Now, these dreamings are hierophanies. But because they are expressions of the same, which is what? The place. And, this does not come from me, but it comes from my, supervisor, this exemplary scholar, to which I owe so many of my insights, Tony Swain, from the University of Sydney, and his amazing book, which has been so much of a debate, and a challenge. A place for strangers. Now, an Australian Aboriginal, towards an Australian Aboriginal being. Now, in this book, he says that the place is topos, the Greek word. So if this sacred is about topos as something really unknown, but there, here, then every dreaming is a hierophany as an expression of the topos, which means it's a topophany. So yeah, so
That's great.
we have to modify hierophanies in the case of Indigenous Australia as topophanies. Any manifestation of topos is a topophany, and it can be, through a piece of art, it can be through a ritual, it can be through a song, it can be of a certain human being, being an aspect of the place, of the topos. So this topology of indigeneity comes into play, and it helps us to modify the theory in a way that is sensitive to the data, the indigenous data, and at the same time confirms, but also enriches and broadens the theory.
That's so interesting. I couldn't help but think about like an inverted, in terms of the sameness and the the paradoxical otherness within sameness because of the, let's say, can you say unknown destination, even though you're
Unknowability or the unknowingness, if
uh,
I can put it.
that there's a convergence of the self is lost in that. Is the self in an indigenous then understanding the goal of the self to be ultimately subsumed by that?
Yes,
Oh wow,
the goal is to be part of that as much as possible, and the ultimate moment is death.
so interesting. I thought about like an inverted nirvana, almost like
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
but within topos. Is that without, because I want to be sensitive to the subject matter, obviously.
Yes, and it's correct.
Conceptually, okay,
It's
yeah,
correct that you bring nirvana in, because nirvana belongs to the the domain of religions that are closer to what I call religions of sameness, and not religions of otherness,
yes.
what we wrongly perhaps call monotheisms or Abrahamic religions. It's the religions of otherness and religions of sameness. So yeah, nirvana comes in definitely,
Oh, interesting.
because it comes under the same typology of religions.
That's so fascinating. I mean, jumping from this point, I mean, we can continue with the indigenous trajectory, or you can broaden it depending on what stimulates a response in you. But another very important term, which is all the rage today. So, of course, all the work was done by the scholars, right, in the 20th century, and yourself, and now it's spilled out into the popular culture and symbolism, like the name of this channel, Terra Symbolica, symbolic Earth, but I mean it in terms of terrain, the terrains that we explore together conceptually and otherwise, or in
Yeah,
terms of
yeah.
genres,
It's very interesting, because the symbolicity, symbols, uh, can fit well into this, because what's the theoretical, background to a symbol? How can one can sustain, in terms of theory, the symbol as such? One way is through a theory of hierophanies. If a hierophany is a manifestation of the sacred, uh, is a means of making the absent sacred present, then this has the two poles that are necessary for any symbol. You cannot have a symbol without two poles. That's the basic, of the basic understanding of the word symbolon. You need two poles, coming together, somehow communicating with one another, fitting, being interlocked, somehow relating. So if you have, the absence and the presence making, visible the absence, or the absence sustaining the presence as something more than it, then every hierophany, any hierophany, or for the indigenous case, any topophany, is symbolic, is a symbol, and
yes.
it's a kind of language. It's a kind of language.
Can
So
you?
Terra Symbolica, the whole of Australia, is a Terra Symbolica.
That's
Yeah,
right.
it's the whole of Australia for Indigenous people is a land that speaks through symbols, through topophanies. So it's a Terra Symbolica. It's very
It,
pertinent. Your title is very pertinent for our this great country of the southern seas.
oh, that's awesome. That just makes me so happy, because like I said, I express my own ignorance, but that's that this should be the flagship talk of the channel then, since
I don't know.
it suits so much the channel's title. Um, but then could you please give some concrete examples of symbolism, artistic or otherwise, within Aboriginal? Well, I'm using Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders not to leave the latter out. We're speaking primarily now of Aboriginal persons and their mythic worldviews. But can you give some specific examples?
Yeah, I mean the most conspicuous example is what we call Aboriginal art.
Yeah.
Every piece of Aboriginal art, what we call Aboriginal art, is a symbol. Because it says something. It says something to whom? to the audience. Who's the audience? The audience is the white people. You know, it's the others. You know, so it speaks to them. But as any symbol, you know, it has something unspoken. It does. There is a an absent background and backdrop. This this is what Aboriginal people, um, Aboriginal artists, programmatically, intentionally, and for a purpose, do not reveal.
That's so
Because
cool.
you are not supposed to reveal everything to everyone, anything to anyone. But on the other hand, Indigenous people had to react. They had somehow to acquire a voice. So how this is if you look at Indigenous art from this perspective, it's a ingenious means of acquiring a voice, you know, saying who you are, stating who you are and your identity to a person, you know, who is out there, who is not supposed to know the core of the identity. And at the same time, you know, you choose all those meanings and experiences that keep, you know, being latent and silent. So it's a very different way. An Indigenous person uh, reads, I mean, or the artist, the Indigenous artist, reads their own creation in a way that is very, very different from the white, Western, or non-Western, uh, uh, but non-Indigenous viewer. We see different things because that's what it's meant to be, and that's the Indigenous symbol, revealing by concealing.
Yeah, that reminds me of not just of mystery religions in general, but the way the earliest Christians communicated publicly through certain signs and symbols, ichthys, which is fish, but the content of their faith was never disclosed. It
Yep.
was partly because of persecution, but partly because it was like, we're not going to give you our sacred things, you know, willy-nilly. So this is a very interesting. Again, it's very archetypal in a sense, you know, the fact that
Yeah, it's a religious strategy that has been, you know, part and parcel of many traditions.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a very powerful and empowering tool and strategy.
that's so interesting. And I mean, in the case of, let's say, the deploying of symbols, because symbolism these days, I mean, there's
Like
been a
what? Like dot?
revival.
Like you mean concrete? Like what? Dots? Like circles? Like, you know, sort of ways that you can, you know, designate on a painting. You know, an emu or a different sort of species like a kangaroo. There's lots of that kind of lowercase symbolism. There's lots of
Ah,
those
okay.
things
Yeah.
which are not strictly speaking symbols. They are more like codes.
Sure. No, I was going to move to the general again. I was
Oh,
moving to
okay.
general,
Sorry.
but no, that's good to know as well. This is important. Do you want to continue that train of
I'm
thought?
just saying that when you
Yeah.
see on a painting, you know, a variety of figures or forms, these are basically codes. We can call them symbols, but they're code. It's a certain coding to denote, you know, who's a person, who's a woman, who's a man, who's a kangaroo, who's an emu. Where's the fire? Where's the campfire? You know, where's the water? But the symbol is the whole. The symbol has a holistic sort of thing. It's a holistic sort of thing. So the whole painting or artwork is the symbol. These little things, you know, here and there that make it up are codes.
You know, it's so interesting because then these codes are communicated to those outside, but and this is my, again, ignorant presumption, but I'm trying to predicate what I'm saying based on what you're saying. For the initiated, right? It's not as though they need to reconstruct the cosmogony because they're living in the cosmogony, in the land. As in, there isn't this part of the problem of otherness or the issue of otherness in ancient religious traditions. And I think that otherness is a complicated thing in Christianity because he's other and near by virtue of the incarnation and all those sorts of things. But part of the problem of otherness is I no longer have access to the time of origins. I have some of the places, like the Nile River and the banks of the Nile, inundated for 6 months, which is the waters of chaos returning, and then verdant for another 6 months and teeming with life, and the hillocks. But somehow the hills, the actual hill that Ra created himself on, okay, in order to create the world, is lost. So I need to then manufacture it using masonry, or or using sandstone. It's not, I don't have it anymore.
Yeah.
So it's like there's somewhere in between both the cosmogony and history, if you like, the unfolding of time and space, which the Egyptians dearly and kind of let's say they tried to hold on to the idea of a cyclical unfolding of time, but death always intervenes.
Yeah, yeah.
Always
Look,
intervenes.
Mario, you're touching something upon something that's very, very sensitive. And look, it's a loss. It's a loss, and it's a trauma.
Yeah,
So yeah, the loss and the trauma is at the heart of religion, and symbolism is a way that proves that, but at the same time, I mean, affirms that, but at the same time tries to negate it by transcending it. The to bring it to the Christian, and let's say to make it a bit provocative at the same time, uh, bring it to the liturgy and the symbolism of the liturgy. It attests to a loss and trauma, which is um, through the liturgy. We are connected with Jesus. We are attempting to do that because he's not anymore with us. He left.
yeah.
So
In the
there
spirit,
is
they would
this
say.
paradox, of knowing that he has left,
Yeah.
but he is here through
Yes.
the. So the symbolism employed, in a religious context, always has this connotation of trauma and loss. But that's the only way you can have it. Religion is not a let's say fairy Mary sort of environment and experience.
You're
It
so
has,
excited.
yeah.
No, no, sorry to cut you off, but now
No, no.
my emotions, because that loss in relation to the ascended Christ, right, in order to have access again, which is stipulated, let's say, by the more ascetical and traditional churches, Catholic, Orthodox, and otherwise, one has to be assimilated by grace and through inordinate strenuous effort almost in order to qualify. So it's not just the loss, the trauma that, okay, well, he's left us a comforter indeed, the Holy Spirit, and we know him through the Spirit, but he's not here with us. But to have access to him, I have to die to my old self and
and
self
you have to and you have to attempt that again and again and
and
again
again
and
and
again.
again and again. And the
Yeah, to
saints,
achieve it, once. Imagine,
yeah, yeah,
sometimes we think of the liturgy, and the other aspects of church life as being very tedious, and again and again the same things. Yeah, but because what you are after is not, easy, because it's not here. So you have to try again and again and again and again.
and it's still a violence that's done to the self, the sleepless nights, the prayer, the asceticism, and then once grasped, like, if we take now the testimonies, I mean, I'll just presuppose the kind of Saint John of the Crosses and Saint Simeon, the new theologians, that they got there, they saw him again in this life, not in a postponed way.
And they lost him again.
They lost him again, and but then they're traumatized by virtue of that loss. And
Yeah.
so
They
this is a
experience,
real
they experience the overcoming of trauma, the healing, only to be, traumatized again.
wow. This is something very interesting. You've touched upon
Yeah,
something
a
very
different topic, a different topic.
it has to be done though. Now that's it. I won't sleep until yeah. And I'm thinking of Seraphim Sarovsky, who saw him in the liturgy, but then was unmovable. They couldn't communicate him. His disciples said for days because he didn't know whether he was coming or going, kind of thing. But this is very.
Yeah.
But to bring it back to Indigenous Australian religion, very briefly, is there a sense then that okay, this loss, the loss was compounded by colonialism? Because the proximity to the land would have been there, the land which is sacred, the topophany, would have remained holistic and intact apart from the colonial circumstances and invasion and all the. Is that the way
No,
that the trauma it comes out?
ostensibly, the indigenous worldviews were not, ideal worlds. They had, their own problems and their own, shortcomings.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, definitely, the sense of not having attained yet the degree of sameness you are after would be the source of your trauma and loss.
wow, wow, that's so interesting.
Again, the inverted sort of logic,
Yes,
but for
yeah,
the same reason.
same. Wow, that's so fascinating. That's so interesting.
I suppose we can go on and on and on and on, but uh,
Shall we then will we end on trauma or the necessity of symbols? How about would you like to reflect on the necessity of symbols?
no,
Uh,
I wouldn't like to, finish with trauma, but
yeah,
it allows us to understand and uh, re-estimate and reevaluate the importance of hope.
yes,
Why hope is so important, especially in traditions of otherness where would dare say the experience of loss and trauma is more, you know, and that's where there is where the experience of hope is more, because it's the only way you can counterbalance this. Okay, for a Christian, the loss and trauma of the absence of Jesus, is not devastating at the end. Eventually, is not
yes.
the final word, because there is so much hope, for to be with Him again.
That's right.
So
And
that's
yeah,
how I would like to, uh, make it more specific, by contextualizing into a Christian, system, and avoiding, the sadness of loss and trauma.
that's right. That's right. The final words of Revelation, Amen. Come, Lord Jesus. This is and I always interpreted
Exactly.
apart from a distant, and the expected second coming when Christ, some of the sayings in the Gospels when he says there are some here that will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in power. This is, and even the parable of the Last Judgment, I think it's it has to do with the experience of death as well, not not exclusively a final universal cosmic judgment, but
Yep.
the end of one's own personal journey in this world. So that hope is nearer for most than let's say expecting the resurrection of the dead in toto. you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
Vasily, I don't want to have the last word. The last word from you will be in relation
No, I
to
mean, the last
what
word
we
is,
may.
I really enjoyed our talk. I mean, we have been doing this, whenever we have the opportunity. But I suppose we conveyed to the viewers of Terra Symbolica a sense of what we do when we drink coffee with one another. So they get, sort of, taste uh, of. Of our talks, and I hope they enjoy the let's say, um, the honesty and the genuine spirit in which we're talking about, academic, scholarly, scientific issues, because uh, academia is not just, something dry, something,
No.
boring. It can be a a life-inspiring endeavor that has a life-meaning, character.
I agree. I agree. We extend the invitation for coffee open to for the Terra Symbolica viewers to join us. If not in person, virtually, we'll continue our work. Vasily, thank you so
Absolutely.
much. It was an absolute
Thank you. It was
pleasure.
my pleasure.
Until next time.